And so a little about our speaker. Dr. Jason Herrmann is an anthropological archaeologist who specializes in the use of digital methods, including geographic information science, or GIS, aerial and satellite remote sensing, and archaeological geophysics, to understand how the environment influenced patterns of settlement and land use, as well as the ways in which people transformed the landscapes in which they lived. He teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, here in the museum, as the Kowalski Family Teaching Specialist for Digital Archaeology in the Center for Analysis of Archaeological Materials at the Penn Museum. And he's a very active researcher. He currently conducts ongoing research projects in Southwest Asia, the Mediterranean, where he studies patterns of settlement and human interaction with landscapes surrounding large urban centers. These projects include a multi-year research project at Murcia in Italy, in Sicily, and long-term excavation and survey projects in Turkey and Iraqi Kurdistan. Closer to home, he's also developed community archaeology projects in Pennsylvania that are integrated with CAM's course offerings in digital archaeology. And among those projects are the fascinating and important work he is doing on African-American cemeteries, which he is going to share with us now as he discusses archaeology's role in protecting African-American burial spaces. Jason.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to go ahead and share these slides. Thank you all for joining me tonight. And there we go. In 1899, Lebanon Cemetery, one of two public cemeteries in the Philadelphia area that served Black people, was condemned and then closed after the cemetery suffered years of decline. When it was first established in 1849, the area around Lebanon Cemetery was considered rural. What was to later be called South Philly was mostly farms and fields producing vegetables and produce and probably livestock that was sold in markets in the city itself. But over the decades afterwards, the cemetery's 11 acres filled to accommodate more than 17,000 remains, including more than 300 Civil War veterans. The cemetery's relative isolation and the fact that it served a vulnerable population made it a prime target for grave robbing in order to meet the demands for cadavers to train students in Philadelphia's medical institutes. And this scandal was exposed in the 1880s in a series of newspaper articles, and arrests and legislation followed that mostly put an end to this practice, in that decade in Philadelphia. But by that time, Lebanon Cemetery and other cemeteries that served poor, Black, indigenous people in the region had fallen into severe disrepair. By the end of the 19th century, Philadelphia had grown to push on Lebanon Cemetery's borders, and the area of the cemetery had been reduced down from 11 to 6 acres. And after it was condemned, the bodies were relocated to Eden Cemetery, or the bodies that remained at least, were relocated to Eden Cemetery in Collingdale, Pennsylvania. Lebanon is only one of dozens of historic cemeteries in South and West Philadelphia that were overtaken by urban expansion and development in the 19th and early 20th centuries. While many of these burials were exhumed and moved to sites outside the urban core, like Mount Moriah in West Philly and Eden Cemetery in Collingdale, others were simply built over, paved over, houses built on them, streets put out in large swaths, some of them at or near the University of Pennsylvania campus, others famously at Schuylkill Yards. Now, advocacy groups have stepped in to relocate and sometimes restore some of these cemeteries that have been neglected or lost. This story is not isolated to Philadelphia. It stretches up and down the eastern seaboard and across the United States. And it also extends into rural contexts across Pennsylvania, where the story is a little bit different. In this case, urban expansion is not the push, but suburban expansion, or the aggregation of agricultural land, has pushed out Black communities, rural Black communities, and divorced them spatially from the cemeteries that serve those communities. A really clear illustration of this comes with Ashley Lemke's article about cemeteries in Texas, where you can see on USGS maps cemeteries appearing in early versions in the 50s and 60s, and later USGS maps literally erasing these cemeteries from their place. We have been tracking this across Pennsylvania as my work with Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds, which I'll introduce a little bit later. Here we have hundreds of primarily African-American cemeteries, many of which are in good state, but some of which have been abandoned. And these have risen into the sort of national consciousness, which you may be familiar with from public media on 60 Minutes and ProPublica, local news, newspapers, where people have kind of a new engagement with the past, trying to resurrect these sacred spaces for America's African Americans. The African American Burial Grounds Network Act legislation has passed through Congress, been introduced, and now they're seeking to fund this resolution. Representative Alma Adams has put the bill forward. Is supposed to fund the reclamation, documentation, re-examination of these burial spaces across the United States, and hopefully restore a lot of these locations. This is part of us trying to restore some of the shared experiences that were shared between those who are buried in these spots and those who wish they pay their respects. A link that has been broken as these communities have been pushed out through agricultural expansion and urban expansion. These movements are in parallel with some reflection that has taken place in archaeology and anthropology itself. Our methods are uniquely suited to help empower communities to reconstruct their stories, reclaim their historical spaces. And in doing so, we can address our discipline's racist past and help to redress some of the historical injustices more broadly. This approach was described in an article entitled Archaeological Reclamation, and relatively recent, and I think Tina can post a link in the comments to this. So the work I present here, I think hopefully you'll find falls into this category. And before I move on to describe my work in this sphere, I want to celebrate the work of some of my colleagues also at University of Pennsylvania and the Penn Museum, Heritage West, where they're doing some community-informed archaeological investigations in West Philly, looking at the Black Bottom neighborhood, reconstructing the lives of people in the 19th and 20th centuries through excavation, through community outreach, fantastic communication on their behalf. So I just want to celebrate them to go on. But back to cemeteries. They're important because they are very often the only point of contact for historians and archaeologists who hope to engage, especially rural communities, rural African-American communities across the United States, because they're often the monument or part of the landscape that remains as people have been displaced, their houses razed, moved out. One project where we're doing this exact sort of work is a work around a site called Payne's Crossing, which has a cemetery, which we documented, I guess it would be 18 months ago now. This work I'm doing with my colleagues at Ohio University and Wayne National Forest addresses a rural Black settlement that was situated across the intersection of 3 Ohio counties, Athens, Perry, and Hocking County, and it was occupied from 1830s until the 1930s. This settlement had the cemetery, which you can see here in the looping video, but also a cooper shop and schoolhouse, roads, farmhouses, and several parcels of land where Black families lived. Now, Payne's Crossing was situated outside of New Straitsville, which was an early mining town in this region. If you're familiar with Southeast Ohio, it's heavily mined, or was, in the late 19th and 20th centuries. And the people who occupied Payne's Crossing were not welcome in New Straitsville for the most part. This landscape was being transformed through mining as it became more industrialized in the late 19th century and 20th century, and the people of Payne's Crossing were pushed away. So our overarching research goals, which began in the cemetery, documenting the locations of unmarked burials, spread out to try to understand the landscape and reconstruct its development over 2.5 centuries, bringing together data from archival research, interviews with individuals and communities, understanding patterns of land ownership through time, and then we have remote sensing surveys and field archaeology. Here's a map of the landscape around Payne's Crossing. And this is an aerial photo. Payne farmstead lie in a sort of bottoms below this ridge where Payne Cemetery was set. And you'll see a lake and some modifications of the landscape in form of roads and paths. These are all completely unnatural. The landscape that is now Wayne National Forest was strip mined. People literally don't live in most of this area anymore because it's been so transformed over time. But you can see how Payne's Crossing is the only kind of clear area in this region, in the area of Payne's Crossing that was occupied by various farmsteads, including the one of the Payne family, which is located right there below, have been completely grown over and more or less lost to the elements. Beginning with our work at Payne Cemetery, our ground penetrating radar survey, including our high resolution topographic survey, highlighted some features that indicate the presence of unmarked graves. And this is important for tracing what's there and hopefully restoring the memory of the people that were interred there. You can see in this grayscale image, there are some depressions, which I've outlined with a little sort of caterpillar pattern that show probably blocks of burials that once lay there. And then these pink spots are anomalies that were recorded in the ground penetrating radar, features that are most likely unmarked graves. Some of them are lighter, representing low confidence in them being a grave shaft, and other of them are darker, indicating that we're pretty sure that they're grave shafts. And you can see there's a mismatch between these black dots, which represent the spots of headstones that we recorded on the surface, and some of the pink spots that represent the likely locations of grave shafts. Now, not all graves are going to be visible in radar. It's very dependent on conditions, your timing, soil moisture, and how well that grave shaft might contrast with the surrounding features. But it is a starting point, and it is always a way to begin the hard work of reconstructing cemeteries in this way. Moving out from the cemetery at Payne's Crossing, we moved down into the forested area surrounding Payne Farmstead, which had been documented in a kind of cursory way by archaeologists prior. You can see their sketch map here, and then the results of 2 geophysical surveys. I'm going to show you the resistance first that followed. Electrical resistance uses an electrical current passing through 2 probes that you insert into the ground to measure how well that current flows. It's affected mostly by water. And so when different types of deposits hold up water in the subsurface in different ways, we get a different response. And the response we got here was the suggestion of possibly 2 building foundations that were not documented by the archaeologists in their prior survey. We hope to expand this work in the future. This was kind of a pilot project that took place with Ohio University and Penn students just 2 years ago. We also measured the magnetic intensity of the ground in that same location. This will help us to highlight the presence of ferrous metal objects, and that is not limited to historic metal objects like fences or nails or hardware from houses, but it can also show very slight changes in the movement of topsoil as people moved soil around or deposited soil in different spots, or maybe dug a pit and filled it with iron-rich soil. In this case, we see mostly the patterns of fence lines indicating a possible road leading in and out of the settlement itself, and the location of a possible foundation. All this is to say, illustrate how cemeteries help us to engage those communities of the past in a broader way. They're usually the starting point. Now, this work is going to continue in the coming years with the help of some archivists at the Ohio University, also with Wayne National Forest, and new historians joining the project from Prairie View University. And of course, our remote sensing survey will expand in the future as well. This type of approach, using remote sensing to engage the landscape, to understand the patterns of land use, and to look at cemeteries specifically, is one I brought into two of my courses, Digital Archaeology, Introduction to Digital Archaeology, and Geophysical Prospection in Archaeology. In both of those, we're using digital field methods to reconstruct the plans, layouts, and histories of the cultural and natural environments of sites that we've been invited to work at. We then take that information and connect it to historical, oral accounts of the sites to kind of paint a broader picture of the life, development of this landscape. This work is done in partnership with two institutions that have been provided fantastic support, and one of which I'll come back to several times over the course of the talk. Primarily, we were working with the Netter Center for Community Partnerships here at the University of Pennsylvania. They bestow upon us the title of academically based community service courses and help to provide support and funding for some of our endeavors, transportation, TAs, and compensation for our community partners who work with us and spend lots of hours doing that. I owe a big debt of gratitude to my friends and colleagues at Pennsylvania Hallowed Grounds as well, which is a consortium of cemetery stewards scattered across Pennsylvania. Their original focus was on burial spaces for United States colored troops, the regiments in the American Civil War, who are buried, hundreds of which are buried in cemeteries that they look after. And this community has been growing and growing. It's a really exciting thing to be a part of. And I'm really proud to work with them and grateful, honestly. Our approach is also part of the broader approach taken by my colleagues in the Center for Analysis of Archaeological Materials. All of our work in CAM is inherently hands-on for students. We provide instruction in laboratories, in the field, where students get to engage things directly through project-based learning. And that is the model for the courses I'm going to present. The work from the courses I'm going to present here. We also offer a lot of research mentorship outside of the courses themselves in archaeological sciences, and we can provide materials and equipment for students at Penn and related universities who are interested in employing some of the specializations that are represented in CAM, like ceramic petrography, archaeozoology, archaeobotany, archaeometallurgy. I teach digital approaches, and these are especially appropriate for what we do in the scope of the community-oriented archaeology that I'm going to present here. They have high potential to support archaeological reclamation of historical spaces. And when I say digital approaches, I mean methods like aerial and satellite monitoring, surface mapping, three-dimensional recording, near-surface geophysics, which I'll talk about quite a bit. And all of these benefit from the fact that they are non-invasive. We don't destroy things through excavation. We don't remove materials. We don't have to disturb material or even touch them for the most part at all. Because they're non-invasive and non-destructive, that means they're also repeatable, which means it makes a great teaching environment. If people get it wrong, we can try it again. It also means that we can engage students who have not been trained. We can engage community members who have not been trained without worry for disturbing the remains, the landscapes, the contexts that lie below. So they're completely non-destructive. And finally, you can see in some of these images here, and some of the images I hope that you find later on, are rich, vibrant images that tell the story quite quickly. They don't require a lot of specialized training for interpretation because we're looking at patterns that we're familiar with. We're looking at cultural patterns like rectilinear shapes. We're looking at patterns of land use that may be familiar to us because most of these are within our own cultural context. Outside of that, we're working in cemeteries, which is a wonderful teaching space. It's been a long time space for archaeologists to teach archaeology. They are built landscapes, completely laden with history and cultural meaning, but the material remains are familiar enough so you don't have to learn a new language. You don't have to become familiar with a new form of expression in art. And we can teach students things about change in style through time. We can teach students skills in mapping, and we can look at patterns of continuity and change that's not hindered by cultural boundaries or a language barrier. What we are doing in these courses is hopefully providing a service to the community members that have invited us to work with them. We assist in this way. We hope we are assisting kind of regional cultural heritage and preservation efforts. We are hoping that we raise the profile of our partners by providing these rich images. And we hope we can generate information that people can use down the road as we further develop this cultural resource and bring it back to life in one way or another. And finally, our courses, and I hope you see clearly in the slides that follow, we're creating opportunities for students to lead research on their own and develop their own connections with people in Pennsylvania hallowed grounds or elsewhere through this kind of endeavor. One example of how we're doing this, and just to spend a little bit of time, came at Eden Cemetery, which is the largest African-American cemetery in the Philadelphia area, oldest African-American Black-owned cemetery in the North, and is the final home for many, as we said before, of the interments that were displaced by urban expansion in South and West Philadelphia in the 19th and 20th centuries. It provides a great opportunity for students to practice using a GIS, using a geographic information system, to relocate the original cemeteries, for example, that hosted these people and connect them to their spots at Eden, or to explore techniques for visualizing movements and networks with geographic data. I'm proud of the work that I've spent just a little bit of time in this. One of the students, graduate of Penn, Vaughn Ortner, did engaging with Eden Cemetery and some of their board directly to address erosion patterns that had taken place across the middle of it, where a creek runs. He was able to use serial satellite imagery from the 1930s and 1940s and modern aerial laser range finding LiDAR data that creates a very explicit topographic map of the site to show how development surrounding Eden Cemetery exacerbated water runoff, contributed to the flow of the stream, and has started to erode the banks on either side of this stream to start to undercut and threaten some of the earlier burials that are buried there. This is one example of how we are able to have student-led research contribute to the missions of these cemeteries and their preservation. But I'm going to spend a lot more time on Mount Zion AME, where I've worked. We've done a lot of work, and I'll do my best to summarize the history here. It's about a ½ acre that sits in front of the oldest church, which is there in the background, which was built around 1880, renovated in 1906, and then again in 1922. The cemetery may be older than the church itself, and most of the markers date to the 19th century. The church is listed on the National Register of Historic Places for this congregation's role in the school fight. It's an anti-segregation boycott that took place in the 1930s. It's also the oldest African-American church on the main line and the longest lasting AME church in that area. It looks, in those pictures, it looks relatively undisturbed, but the cemetery itself has not been completely free from damaging incursions and the effects of time. It's close on either, you can see it's flanked by roads on either side in this image here. And based on the proximity of some of the westernmost markers and anecdotes of congregation members and local residents, it's possible that one of these roads has been installed on or over parts of full burials. For example, one grave marker faces west directly into a bush that faces right up against the road. This couldn't have been in this way in the past, and it's startlingly close to Berlin Baptist Road there on the bottom of the screen. Moreover, the gravestones, many of them have sunk partially or mostly into the ground, making their inscriptions difficult to read. And according to some longtime church members, cemetery used to be absolutely full of markers, whereas now you can see in this image here, it's fairly sparse, which means some of them have either been lost in other ways or sunk completely into the ground, and it's necessary that they be recorded. Janessa Reeves, a student in Intro to Digital Archaeology, also a graduate of Penn now, has moved on to more wonderful things, helped to record these things by developing an online recording system in open source software that can be shared with cemetery stewards thereafter. It's one way to kind of empower people doing the work of cemetery preservations at a grassroots level through the use of these digital recording tools and providing them with a framework that can centralize and standardize a collection of field data. And this open source application, it's wonderful. It can be run on any device that has an internet connection, just runs through a browser, and it's originally meant for actually humanitarian organizations for documenting medical emergencies in the field, but we were able to adapt it for preservation and conservation for our purposes. So she and I and some other students went out and we documented all of the monuments out there at Mount Zion AME. She made an online map, which maybe is going to show up in your comments, in the chat in a little bit, which you can visit yourself. And this online map was able to allow her to make some initial observations using the capabilities of the GIS and her analysis. And she could find that most of the burials and their inscriptions face west, but which is kind of counter, right, to how many Christian cemeteries operate, and mostly, and definitely mostly African-American cemeteries as well. And Miss Jackman, the cemetery steward, church historian, and a close collaborator, has suggested that perhaps the side entrance to the old church used to be on the west side of the building, and it was later moved to the east side, and so that the burials were oriented to the original church entrance. This would help us to kind of do some further analysis to compare the dates of burials and the directions of inscriptions to see if there's correlation after the main entrance is moved, and it's something that we'll do a little bit later. We also looked at the broader landscape using our fine-grained topographic mapping techniques and our subsurface investigations through archaeological geophysics. We did topographic survey, magnetic radiometry, which I've introduced before, electrical resistance survey. You've also seen this machine at Payne's Crossing already. And we did ground penetrating radar surveys. And these were done, were mostly student collected data, done in conjunction with members of Mount Zion AME. I'll show you some of those results. Starting again with the image mosaic, which we created with photos from a drone. And this image is corrected for distortions from distance that you might find from distance and the angle of the photography. So it is a measurable plan map where everything can be measured equally from the tops of the headstones, which would be normally distorted from being closer to the viewer, to the plane of the ground and the depressions of some of the grave shafts. To create that flattened aerial photo, we first had to create a topographic surface to control those distortions. And that topographic surface is quite revealing, as you can see. We can see, as these darker gray spots show, lots of local depressions that could indicate the location of a collapsed grave shaft. And you can see that some of these are closely associated with the bright headstone tops shown in this elevation model, and some of them are not. Doing kind of a cursory maximal interpretation, we can locate the spots for dozens of possible graves. And this is not a stretch of the imagination, since this community, this cemetery served a community that existed, for hundreds of years now, and was obviously a center of the community in the 19th century and early 20th century. Other geophysical methods also help to understand the transformation of this landscape as well. Right here, we're seeing a map of magnetic intensity over the same space. And I will try to go through what we're seeing here. You can see in the black, these harsh black shapes are the locations of headstones. And some of them are associated with a strong magnetic response, where you have very strong white and black in the background. These are the north and south poles of magnets, basically. And a lot of these headstones had an iron bar that would connect the footing stone to the headstone that came up. But most striking, right, in this image is this big stripe cutting right through the middle, which indicates, which we found after we did the magnetic map. We then poked around and realized that an electric line was laid in there sometime in the 50s or 60s, cutting through some of the burials that had been documented, really undercutting a lot of the graves. This is basically a bunch of wires that had been dug right through the middle of the cemetery. We also did a ground penetrating radar survey where we were able to also map some burials, the buried utilities, and the influence of the later construction of the roads. So right now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at increasingly deep slices going down. One of the advantages of ground penetrating radar is its ability to represent depth very clearly, whereas the other two methods I showed were one-dimensional or two-dimensional images. This one, we can go increasing depth, and you may want to watch this little Z on the top to tell us how many feet we are below the ground surface. So here we're at the top, and our first observation we have is that we have these two bounding lines on the edges. We interpret this as disturbance from overburden from the construction of the roads or the renovation or expansion of the roads on either side of the cemetery. I'm going to start the video, and we'll see as we go down, we see the electric line show up, and we also see some very strong black anomalies come in and out of focus as we go deeper and deeper down. Not all of these graves would be dug to the same depth. We are on a hilltop. I think that the bedrock is relatively close to the surface. So we would have the bottoms of grave shafts occurring at different depths throughout. It also probably has something to do with the type of caskets that's buried there, the condition of the casket that are buried there, and the contrast of the grave shaft and the casket with the surrounding soils. At the bottom, you'll see some horizontal stripes, and this is where the noise in the data is outstripping the actual data. So we are getting into geology and basically some useless levels right there. We can bring all these data sets together, and we did, to provide a broader interpretation, and gave it to the church historian, Ms. Jackman, so she can start looking at it and comparing what we have with the logs that are recorded in the church archives. Many burials are not represented on headstones. Some of them are represented in logs, and vice versa. And one thing we have to be careful with, especially with geophysics, is the potential for false positives in these instances is actually quite high. We are also able to take these images out in the field and use them to talk to people affiliated with the church and the burial grounds and help them connect them to their experiences in the past. This is actually quite fulfilling and something that in past semesters, we've had students present individual projects to the community members at the end of the class, either on Zoom or engaging them in the field, like you can see here. Now, these are scenes from a short film that was created by Ms. Jackman, the church historian. I encourage you after this, not right away, to follow the link that Tina is providing and watch it for yourself. It is part of a series by Scribe Video Center about community spaces, and community members made these films themselves. They're fantastic. The one that is linked in the comments here is called The Cornerstone, Mount Zion AME, and it's part 2 of 2 films that are in one video. I don't want to discourage you from watching all of the videos in this series because they're exceptionally moving, fantastic. But if you watch one and you want to connect it to this talk, you can watch The Cornerstone and learn more about Mount Zion and its history. But I think you get a picture of how we are operating and how we're bringing things forward. Our work at Mount Zion and several other cemeteries is coming to a close. That doesn't mean we're going to lose contact with our friends at these spaces, or I hope not. But we have new prospects on the horizon, and one I'm particularly excited about is at Lindley Hill Cemetery in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, where we've begun some work this spring. We're working with Reverend Barry, who is the leader of the congregation, closely affiliated with this burial space. And you can see some of the results of our initial work in the links that Tina are providing here. What you're looking at in this still image, but you can engage in 3 dimensions, are the results of an aerial LiDAR survey where lasers are shot down from a drone and map the entire space in 3 dimensions. And you can fly through this cloud of individual points yourself later on if you are inclined. This aerial LiDAR survey is not just good for giving us a picture of the trees and you can see the cars in the road and the pretty colors of the fall foliage, which happened to be out there when we were there, but it can also be used to generate these high resolution topographic models that can again help us to connect the collapsed grave shafts, which you can see here very clearly, and the presence of gravestones. In this case, we haven't done, now I have to say, we've only done a little bit of work at Lindley Hill. We're very excited about continuing. In March, we will be going out to do a ground penetrating radar survey with my Introduction to Archaeological Geophysics course. Next fall, we will go out and record the vast variety of monuments which dot Lindley Hill Cemetery, and maybe do some other things. But our initial observations just from this LiDAR survey don't just show us the presence of these dimples that clearly show a lot of grave shafts. They also show us some earlier land use or possible property boundaries that we can confirm later on when we look at some of our historic documents. You can see a ridge here. These are the cemetery bounds. Out here where it gets really smooth are places where the LiDAR didn't penetrate the vegetation, or there's just like a giant tree trunk that I sliced off so we could look at the ground surface. Lindley Hill was, these grounds did have a church that burned down in the 1930s. You can see here the foundations are still slightly preserved. It's heavily vegetated, and it'll be interesting to see what we can do also with our non-invasive digital approaches as we go forward. I hope you enjoyed seeing some of the work that we're doing to bring students out in the field and have them learn digital methods, learn to collect, interpret, process, and share these methods, at the same time engaging with community members affiliated with some of these spaces, and hopefully advancing their mission. This work could not have been done without the assistance of a lot of institutions. When we started this in 2019, I had a warm welcome from people at the Philadelphia Archaeological Forum who were willing to share with me this data and to put me in touch with people who might be interested in working with me. From then on, we started to work with Mount Zion AME, where Bertha Jackman, pictured here, and Reverend April Martin have been some of our best collaborators and really great friends. We've worked with Eden's Cemetery and Sheila Jones, and looking forward to our partnership with Lindley Hills Cemetery, where Angela Rice and Reverend Ivory Berry have been super welcoming and exciting and really invigorating. None of this work was done solely by me, and students from Intro to Digital Archaeology courses starting in 2019 up until the present, as well as students in geophysical prospection starting in 2020 up until the present, have contributed all in one way or another. And finally, I want to give a special thanks to members of the CAM Digital Archaeology Lab, Eric Hubbard, Chris Lamack, and Olivia Lee, who are always up for going out and scouting out a new place, or helping me in the field, or supporting me in any other way. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope that I can answer some of your questions following up. Thank you very much.